This episode of Planted is brought to you by Pax Labs,
the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Planted with Sara Pine. I'm Sara Pine, your host, and today we're diving into one of the most fascinating pieces of cannabis folklore I've come across in a long time. My guest today is journalist Lester Black, who is a news editor at SF Gate, and whose work has appeared in 538, High Country News, and The Guardian, and he's also was the cannabis columnist for The Stranger. Lester, welcome. I'm so excited to talk with you today, and I gotta say, I love the article, and I'm just really looking forward to digging into it and some of your processes.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, Sara. It's a real honor.
Oh, absolutely. I've been meaning to talk to you for a long time, so this is a treat for me. But before we get into all of that, I want to ask you the question I ask all of my guests their first time on the show. What was your first cannabis experience?
Yeah, taking me way back. So my first experience was when I was a teenager in the suburbs of Seattle, trying cannabis with some friends. And honestly, it was like a pretty big letdown. Like I think for a lot of people, like I didn't have much of an experience the first time I tried it. I would say though, like the first experience that really opened my eyes to cannabis in a whole new way was when I was about probably 10 years after that, when I was in my mid-20s. And my mom has arthritis in her hands. And I'd heard that cannabis cream can help with arthritis. And I, at that point, loved cannabis, big fan, but had really no faith in the medical properties of it. And I just thought, it's just something people say. So I got some cannabis cream and gave it to my mom. And, she has really severe arthritis in her hand that'll really lock up. And it just pretty quickly, within, I'm not sure exactly how long, but before too long, her hands really relaxed and it was working. And so seeing that like real effect in the real world made it honestly changed the trajectory of how I started writing about cannabis, because it went from something that was like, I love cannabis, this is fun, this is just kind of like, and I also love beer and this stuff. And it was like, oh, this is a little more serious and a little more interesting and a little bit more surprising than what I thought about cannabis. So that moment almost sticks out more in terms of like a first experience versus the first time I tried it.
Yeah, I totally get that. I was a precocious kid, so I tried it early on. Also, did not have a satisfying experience, did not get high, but it was also my first experience of going back to the person that I purchased it from and saying, I want my money back. It was a senior in high school, and he's like, sure, kid. Takes it back. Don't get anything back at all. I was like, wah wah. But like in my late 30s, when I ended up with cancer and I used it for the first time medicinally, that was like my aha moment. But even more so, I think, when I started working in the dispensary and seeing the impact that it had on other people who had different issues. And that was like, I always loved it, but I never thought you and I would be sitting here talking about it. Like it was enjoyment, but not engagement further beyond that until you hear people's stories and you understand like how multifaceted it is. And then,
Exactly.
yeah. And then you get into the history like you are with this article.
Yeah, well, that multifaceted part is like what I had from that experience with my mother, where it was like I already knew that the lies told about cannabis were wrong. Like I had experienced enough to know that it was not some thing that will ruin your life and destroy your health and rot your brain. But I just like had no idea that these medical sides were possible as well. And so like that's why I became really a cannabis journalist, as I saw there's so many different areas of this plant and how we've interacted with it. And it's really fun as a cannabis journalist because you get to just dive into different things every day, basically, from the science to the law to the business to like what I think we're going to talk about today, the history of it, because we've, as humans, used it for so long.
How long have you been writing? Well, writing about cannabis, I should say.
I've been writing about cannabis for 10 years now. Yeah, I started in journalism really traditionally as like a city hall reporter and a breaking news reporter at a daily newspaper in Tennessee, actually. And then I moved back home to Seattle in my early 20s, and the the topic that was really happening was legalization, because Washington, of course, is like one of the early states to legalize. And I was a politics writer, and I just kind of quickly married the two of like, well, I know politics, I know law, and I really love cannabis. And so I could write about these things together. And so kind of slowly grew from there, where it started as like, probably writing a story every other month. To then I became the cannabis columnist for The Stranger. So I was writing about it every week. And then just really continued to go deeper and deeper into it. And then I'm now a news editor at SFGate, but I actually was hired there 3 years ago as their cannabis editor. So I was really solely focused on cannabis for a while.
Well, one thing I really appreciate about your writing is you have a critical eye, because when we look at cannabis, it can be very black and white. It can be either, hide your wife and kids, cannabis is coming to your town, or, sometimes like people in the industry are like, oh, it does everything. It's a panacea, da da da. Like when I was first going to conferences, I'd have, friends or colleagues that would introduce me as, this is Sara. She cured her colon cancer with cannabis. And I was like, let's not say that. Like did I use it for symptom management? Absolutely. Is there research that shows that it can help as a part of an integrative medical therapy for your cancer? There is stuff out there that says it may, but we have a lot more to go. Or like during COVID, when people were like, CBD can, protect you from COVID. And it's like, let's have more balanced conversations about the fact that there are good things, there are bad things, there are things we can't prove, and let's put it all on the table, because if we don't do it ourselves as an industry, somebody else is going to come in and really blow it up and make it look bad. And if we keep refuting these things like, hello, CHS, we're going to be totally on the menu.
Yeah, I'm glad you appreciate it, because I'll say not everyone in cannabis has appreciated my critical look over the years, because I think it's very important to talk about all aspects of cannabis, like CHS, or also I think cannabis addiction. That's something that, as a cannabis user myself, like I'm pretty keyed into some of those aspects. But I also, really want to write about how cannabis is helping people. Cannabis is likely, improving public health in many ways. And I honestly see, this is from when I first got into writing about cannabis, that this was like the next generation of cannabis journalism needed this, because for so long, all media was totally dogmatic, saying cannabis was really bad for you, it was evil, it was bad. And then there was the alternative media, which really needed to be the cheerleader for cannabis. Those journalists who were, running High Times and running all weeklies for decades needed to really say like only the good things, because they had to balance out this side that was happening. But come like 2014, cannabis is legally being sold. The state governments are getting very involved in it. I saw it was like, okay, now we need to go to the next level where we need to talk about both. And as a journalist, I'm not gonna. I will touch cannabis, I will smoke cannabis, I will engage with these products, but I'm going to maintain a critical eye and try and find what actually can I confirm, what experts can I talk to. I want to quote people who say things like, this will not work for that. Cannabis vapes are problematic because of contamination from heavy metals, things like that. I want to bring those people into the conversation alongside the other information that cannabis is not all evil. So thanks for being appreciative of it, because I'll say like not everyone over the years has appreciated that critical look.
Well, I think it goes back to, the early days where people are like, oh, well, if we even look at this, everything is going to get shut down, but it's actually quite the opposite. But what do you think about, and I promise we're going to get into the article because I'm really excited about that. But, we're seeing a lot more clickbait articles from mainstream media that's really going back into more stigmatized arenas. Do you think that it's because the tide has turned politically? Do you think it's because, I think back in the day, a lot of mainstream media was hoping that they would get more advertising and support from the cannabis industry, and that didn't turn out the way they wanted it to. But everybody's broke. Like, it's really hard to do that. What do you think is driving this now?
So I think it's a complicated picture where there's a few different things happening. Like one, the general media landscape right now is incredibly challenged, not just cannabis media, but all media. Most media companies are not making money. At least the ones doing, traditional journalism are just they're losing money. So it's not just cannabis that's getting a less thoughtful eye from journalists. Everything is. And that's just the problem when Google and Meta can take all the ad dollars of the entire world, and no one's really buying subscriptions to newspapers anymore. It's like in that environment, no story is, or many stories are getting lost, and many stories are being done in kind of shoddy ways. So that's happening. Uh, in terms of where we are at with cannabis, like in my point of view, we're at a shifting narrative right now. It kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like this newer generation where we have cannabis commercialization, which I think is the most accurate way to call it. Legalization is a little bit, too black and white because it's still illegal federally, but we have widespread cannabis commercialization. We have incredible increases in cannabis use. Uh, and society is changing fast because of that. The conversation is almost coming to a different phase where instead of it being this curiosity of, oh, wow, you could go buy cannabis is so interesting, maybe what we're writing back in like 2014 to 2018. Now it's like, well, of course you could buy cannabis. That's not surprising to me. But
Right.
what else is happening? And that we're just at a moment where now there's gonna be probably more negative conversation around it because it's just not as new and shiny and unique. I think there's always possible backstepping with reform. I wouldn't say anything's guaranteed,
Mm.
but it's going to be very hard for them to, you know, stop this train. Them meaning people who want to, prohibit cannabis. There was, of course, a big New York Times op-ed written last month that was calling for some pretty regressive cannabis policies, including like limiting potency. And that scared a lot of people, but I don't think we see, even if we see more of those coming out from like mainstream left-leaning outlets, I don't think we're going to see like suddenly cannabis not being sold legally in the majority of states. Like that train's moving and the conversation around it's going to keep changing.
Yeah, I think in many ways it's a call for more education too. And a friend of mine actually texted me a link to that article in another New York Times article. We were on the phone and she's like, "What do you think about this?" And I went out in this tirade and she's like, "Ah, did I upset you?" I'm like, "No, no." I'm just like I just would really, really like to see more articles where instead of like this big shocking headline and then you have to dig in and be like, well, it may not be like that, but blah blah blah, because nobody's taking the time in this age where we're inundated with social media and everything and we're like this instant gratification mix and serve society. There are very few people who are digging into the meat of what's going on or going into and saying, well, this research says this, but did you look at the research? Did you see actually what they said? They said possibly, maybe. They didn't say definitely. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't, but it also doesn't mean that it does.
Right.
So, but anyway, let's get into the article because I
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this, and I was just I'd heard of Big Sur Holy Weed. I actually had tried something that I was told was Big Sur Holy Weed, and as we dig in, we'll say that may or may not be true. But for listeners who haven't read the article yet, what is the legend of Big Sur Holy Weed?
Yeah. So the legend of Big Sur Holy Weed um, is that a long time ago, and I say a long time ago because different people say different times, but a long time ago, 50 to 60 years ago, uh, a monk on the Big Sur coast combined a couple different cannabis plants, bred them together, and created a new cannabis plant that was powerful and uplifting and energizing and he called it Big Sur Holy Weed. And most people say this monk's name was Perry. And the hippies who were living in Big Sur at the time found the weed and then used it to meditate and to power drum circles and eventually it got out from Big Sur down to Los Angeles and then around the world. And from there, this name, which itself I think has a lot of kind of enigmatic characteristics, has carried on this strain of this generally thought of as a more of a sativa leaning, energetic form of cannabis that formed in Big Sur.
Still smoking joints? Okay, we need to talk. If you love cannabis but you're still lighting it, let's look at what's actually happening. When you burn flower, you're creating smoke, and that smoke contains harmful compounds like tar, soot, benzene, and formaldehyde. In fact, almost 200 different compounds have been detected in joint smoke. So how do we know this? PAX decided to study it. In controlled lab testing, they compared joint smoke to vapor from their devices, using the same flower under the same conditions, and measured 16 key harmful compounds. The result is pretty striking. Vaporization reduced those compounds by more than 95%, because when you heat cannabis instead of burning it, you change what you inhale. You still get cannabinoids and flavor, just without all the extra stuff that comes from smoke. This isn't about judgment, it's about information. If you want to learn more, go to pax.com/science. Pax is setting higher standards so you can smoke less smoke. And for Planted listeners, get 20% off at pax.com with code PLANTED20. When you started hearing about it, did you think you were chasing a real strain or more of a cultural myth? Or did you know?
So that's a good question. So I first heard about Big Sur Holy Weed from Jim Roberts, who's up in Mendocino County, and he has an incredible cannabis farm with like every plant at his farm has a story. It's a beautiful place with a wide variety of cannabis genetics, many of which are from this older time, from the 60s and 70s, or even older. I think he has a lot of
Yeah.
landrace stuff from around the world. Um, and he was just showing me his farm, and he kind of pulled this one aside. He's like, "Oh, this is Big Sur Holy Weed. Have you ever heard about this?" And he told me that story. Although, Jim's like a real straight shooter, and he was like, "Here's what I've been told about it. I don't
Yeah.
know if this is true, but here's what I've been told." And because it was coming from Jim, who's someone who's so trusted and thoughtful, I did not immediately think, "Oh, this is like a lie." Like, whereas I think, you hear a lot of stories in cannabis, and I think sometimes someone says something and I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I have very little faith in that being true. For Jim, saying it, and especially Jim has a connection to Southern California and to like these older cannabis groups that would have been involved in this. I thought, maybe this is true. And from there, and this is how the story formed, is it literally formed up there. I mean, he told me about this form of cannabis. And I was like, I should try and figure this out. Like, I should try and figure out where this came from. And I just started pulling the thread of, he said, here's who I got this from. I got these genetics from a guy named Hardy Nito, from Cora Genetics. He said, there's that guy I got it from. And then also there's this 80-year-old breeder who lives in Santa Cruz called Kagyu, who really confirmed what I have as Big Sur Holy Weed. And so I tried to find both of those people, Hardy Nito and Kagyu, and then just kind of kept trying to trace the steps as much as I could to see, like, is Jim Roberts' Big Sur Holy Weed really Big Sur Holy Weed? And at the beginning, I really wanted to find Perry the monk. Like, I wanted to find this reclusive monk who did this early genetics work. I didn't really think he was alive, given if he was breeding in the 1950s or 60s. But I thought maybe I could find some trace of him, and that would be a really amazing story. And then I guess part of this is, part of the important part of how I got into this is, like, I write for sfgate.com, which is based in San Francisco. We cover Big Sur just as like a story itself, not the cannabis side of it, but just the tourism and the people who live down there and the culture. So I also felt that it was going to be worth it to my editors and my bosses if I was like spending time on something that was related to Big Sur. If this was just the holy weed of some other part of the country or something, it probably wouldn't have been a story for us. So I kind of had the building blocks of like something worth spending time on, and then spent basically 2 years trying to chase every lead I could find.
Oh, I Big Sur is one of my most favorite places on earth. And I think anyone who's been there, it's like it's really the beauty is captivating. There is something kind of mystical about it, especially like when you're, by the water with the kelp forests and like when it gets really misty and foggy and just the stories that have come through about like, whether it's the hippies, the counterculture, or even like Hollywood people like hiding out there and it being kind of like a reprieve. But I think a lot of people don't know that Big Sur has had cultivation there for generations, and it kind of was a best kept secret for a long time.
Yeah, and I didn't either. Like I said earlier, I've been writing about cannabis for 10 years, and that entire time I knew of the Emerald Triangle, Mendocino, Trinity, and Humboldt
Yeah.
counties up in Northern California as being really like the ground floor of California cannabis. And I had no idea Big Sur had its own part in that. And the other thing that I had no idea about until I started researching this story is how little cannabis was cultivated in California in the 1950s and earlier. Basically none. I mean, across the US, very little, but especially California had almost no cannabis cultivation history. I've interviewed some cannabis growers in California who are like, I'm a multi-generational cannabis grower, and that's really important. And especially now that we're in legalization, where a lot of those people have been pushed out of business, I've kind of leaned into that. I've been like, oh, well, this is a multi-generational cannabis grower. Their grandparents grew cannabis. But when I did this story, I realized it's only three generations. Like I don't know anyone who has four generations of cannabis cultivation
Yeah.
in California. Maybe they exist out there. I'm not saying they don't exist, but if you look at the statistics and the history before really 1969 even, very little cannabis is grown in the US. Very little is grown in California. Most of it's grown in Mexico and imported, or grown in Southeast Asia and imported. And then as the war on drugs really increased, and especially when Nixon became president and he increased it, they shut down the borders. They made it more expensive and a bigger penalty to move cannabis across borders. And of course, enterprising fans of cannabis and hippies looking for a way to make some money were like, why don't we just grow it here? And that's where Big Sur fits in. And at the same time that the Emerald Triangle is first starting to be developed, Big Sur is being developed. So there's a bunch of hippies in San Francisco in the 1960s. There's a Summer of Love. The city itself is pretty small and gets pretty crowded, and people are like, hey, let's go find some woods to really do something interesting. And they go both north to Humboldt County and Mendocino County, but they also go south to Big Sur, Monterey County. And that's where this story looks at, is that those hippies who went down south, they ended up really having a huge impact on the future of cannabis across the whole world for a couple of reasons, because of what they were doing in the 1970s in Big Sur.
Well, you were mentioning in your article that you were talking to one of the last licensed cultivators in Big Sur, and that they just recently gave up their license. I know, like when we were going into legalization, that was one of the times when it was the first time that a lot of those farmers kind of came out to talk about cultivating and to be visible. What's uh, what's going on with that?
Yeah. Well, this is so that farmer, Kodiak Greenwood, he had the last legal farm in Big Sur, and his license lapsed because he couldn't afford to spend. It would have been definitely over 100,000, maybe $200,000 in costs related to, upgrading roads and all of these infrastructure improvements that cannabis farms in California have to do. So he no longer has a license. There is no legal cannabis farm in Big Sur. That, part of the stories, I think part of the reason for me to write this story was to talk about people like Kodiak, but also talk about people like Jim. Jim still has his farm. I'm not saying it's going out of business, but the first time I met Jim, there was a proposed law that was really about to become law in California, and it was going to drive his entire farm out of business. And so I met him in that framework of like, hey, we're about to be pushed out. And every single cannabis person I'm talked to in this 6,000 word story is either out of business or at risk of getting out of business or being pushed out of business. And so that's the reality of legalization across this country, but especially California, where if you're doing this really interesting work on legacy genetics on a small scale, really like the true like mom and pop farms, it's nearly impossible to stay in business. And That, part of telling the story, I wanted to capture what's happening right now in that way because it's pretty ironic where California has this remarkable history of cannabis genetics and cannabis cultivation. They have remarkable farmers, but legalization isn't set up a way to make sure those people cannot stay in the industry. And I don't have answers, really to how to solve that, but I definitely can shine a light on what's happening right now, and hopefully something can come out of it.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with Fiona Ma this weekend. I did an interview with her, and her view is that we should get rid of 64 and just do something else. I gotta say I voted for it, but only for the simple fact that it seemed like every time it came to ballot, there were, I always call them greedy guts. There's like more greedy guts that feel like brave enough to get involved, and they may not have the best of intentions, and they may not even want to participate in cannabis at all, but they're more interested in the ancillary prospects. And so they kind of mess things up. And that was the reason that I voted for it. And I thought we could make changes once we were established, but it just doesn't seem like that's working.
Yeah, that's definitely a growing conversation in California, right? Is like, do we just get rid of 64? The Like I said, I don't know the exact way forward. That's kind of like the benefit of being a journalist. You don't have to have answers. You just have to like shine a light on what's happening and point
Right.
out how whoever else is wrong, and not have to be right in that sense. The thing I would shine a light on though is that if you take a critical look at 64, it wasn't like there were a bunch of bad actors coming in and changing everything, and that's why we're here. Many of the people right now who are the loudest saying this thing's broken, these are bad decisions, if you go back and you look, they were arguing for exactly what many of the things in 64 are. So I think that there has to be a lot of like honesty from cannabis folks and saying, hey, we got this wrong. This wasn't like, Wall Street came in, or a lot of people say like Newsom's goons came in and did this stuff. Some of that happened, right? Like especially the 1 acre cap is like the thing most people will point to, and that truly was taken away in a way that seemed pretty kind of behind closed doors and shocking to people. That's true. But a lot of these other things that everyone was arguing for, like these multi-tiered systems, these tax rates, were fully developed with a lot of legacy, 215 era people saying, let's do this way. So to go forward, I think the first step is to say, hey, we got a lot of this wrong. And California did not look at Colorado, did not look at Washington and say, hey, what's going on up there? They said, we're different. You could even, it's kind of amazing to me, but you can go back and see people quoted in stories saying, we're different. We're not going to look at what happens in Colorado. And so if we want to make something better in the future, maybe it's get rid of 64, maybe it's find some way to modify more of it, but let's just be honest that we got a lot of this wrong. And so I think that kind of has to be foundational. The other thing when we think about reforming California's current system is that as a politics person, like my background is in political science, you look at like how these things get written and how coalitions form. And cannabis is a really tiny topic. Most people don't care about cannabis. And that's just a fact. Like that's one thing we see in media when we write these stories. We can see like if you want to look at like like the Golden State Warriors, the NBA team, and cannabis. Like cannabis is so much further down on people's lists than the NBA team, or weather, or like the price of gas in their tank. And so if you want to have like a wholesale rewrite of a big law like 64, you better have everyone in cannabis working together. Because as soon as you have division, which is natural, but you're gonna lose the connection to the lawmakers and to the voters. So I would say for everyone looking at how to make it better, and I really applaud everyone to do that because we need to remember, like we got a lot wrong 10 years ago, and remember we got to have a consensus if we're going to have anything happen. Because if we don't have a consensus, and a consensus between like these smallest farms that I'm really passionate about, the ones that are 10,000 square feet and have 50 plants, and also the ones that are, $500 million operations in Ventura County. If you don't have everyone saying, here's the better way forward, if you have those sides fighting each other, then what you're probably going to end up is really similar to what we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just California too. Other states have made that same, they just keep reinventing the wheel without looking and seeing what's working and what's not working. I used to say, hubris is the word of the year in the industry, but I've been saying that for 10 years. So I don't know,
Yeah.
I feel like between that and working together, we shoot ourselves in the foot constantly. And I also think that having the conversation about, like, using the Emerald Triangle, for example, during the 215 days, medicinal cannabis, you saw thriving downtowns, great, education systems. And if we could really get the public and, our elected officials to understand that if we could support small businesses, the jobs stay in those areas, the money stays in those areas, and looking at it as, I believe in the movement strongly, but that's, and policy, a lot of people will say, like Bo Whitney, my friend who's the economist, will say, policy isn't based on fact, it's based on emotions. But you'd still have to have the facts there to be able to capture the imaginations of the people who are building these laws and the people who are voting on these laws. Um, but getting into like what's going on in the here and now, it's really easy to get facts and talk to people and track down the information. But how do you verify stories when documentation is limited and memories conflict when you're looking at like the history of something that's been so underground for so long?
Yeah, and that's like the big challenge with this Big Sur Holy Weed story is like, so I went out to try and find like, hey, how do we find out if this plant that Jim has is Big Sur Holy Weed, and how do we find out what Big Sur Holy Weed was 60 years ago? And the record is just not there. And I started this story as like, pretty like basic traditional journalist saying like, hey, let me just find the facts. And if the facts aren't there, then it's not real. And after I really had a shift after over a year doing this and consistently finding out that the facts, that many of the story could not possibly be true. I then kind of re-looked at what was happening and realized that we can't hold cannabis the same this we can't hold cannabis history to the same level that we hold other histories because of prohibition, because of these people like I interview Kagyu, this he's 81, and he's been growing cannabis since 1969 in Santa Cruz, and he has had such a scary experience. He's a small time guy. He's never been a big grower, never made a lot of money in cannabis. He was just, I think he has a religious tie to cannabis, and to growing, like gardening. And he was putting his whole life on the line. He was putting his entire family's financial future on the line to grow cannabis, up until probably like 15 years ago. So when you're in that world where if you have two cannabis plants, federal agency can come and take all of your property away. You're not going to write down what you're doing. You're not going to take a bunch of photos and make sure that a journalist in 40 years can prove that this was the Big Sur Holy Weed, right? You're not doing that. And so we can't hold cannabis history to the same level that we would hold other histories. That like, oh, well, if there isn't validation that Big Sur Holy Weed was like this, then it couldn't possibly have been like this. Well, that's actually not really true in this case. You're kind of essentially taking the biases of prohibition and assuming that the world was like that, but really it was prohibition was kind of modulating the world. And so kind of like I start the story by looking into this myth, and I start the reporting 2 years ago by looking into this myth. I'm really excited about it. I see other people saying these things and seeming to confirm them. I then go out and try and find the monk, and really all the monasteries down there are pretty united saying like that it's not possible. I talked to some cannabis geneticists and scientists, and they say, given how genetics was working back then, that it was a really haphazard process. The idea that there would have been one strain from 1969 carrying forward, or even from 1969 to 1970, doesn't really exist because it's all open pollination. So then I'm like, okay, like, this is all bullshit. Like, there is no Big Sur Holy Weed. Uh, but then, as I got deeper into what was really happening at that time, um, I really softened that. And then the other part of the story that I became really, really fascinated by was the growth of like Sinsemilla, this producing cannabis without seeds, pulling male plants out of fields. And for people like us, like, I never grew up with a lot of seeded cannabis. Of course, I've had seeds in cannabis over the years, but I never had like bags of cannabis that were filled, half with seeds. So I don't remember what it was like because I wasn't alive then. But before 1970s, cannabis in the U.S. was really seeded, and something happened where farmers realized if you pull male plants, the female flowers don't get seeded. The female flowers are more potent. And what I discovered is that Big Sur was really close to the ground floor of that movement. They didn't invent the technique, but they really popularized it, including by publishing, farmers down there published a book called Sinsemilla Marijuana Flowers that was printed 100,000 times, which is really a wild number given that
Yeah.
time and the illegality. But they really spread the word on how to grow this type of cannabis. And Big Sur Holy Weed would have been a Sinsemilla plant, one of the first Sinsemilla plants grown in California. So I kind of was on this arc where it's like, okay, it's all fake, but then actually something happened with Big Sur Holy Weed, something happened with those hippies down there where it really was impactful and it was a big change. And uh, none of that was actually in the record. Like, that book is totally anonymously written. There's nothing that says Big Sur in it. And I was the first journalist to confirm that it was from Big Sur. So I kind of like was going back and filling in some of those blanks that Prohibition forced upon us by doing this reporting. And in effect, like, really seeing the importance of this strain of cannabis in these people, whether or not the monk is real. And at this point, I lean towards him not being real, but I would love someone to prove me wrong. Show me some records, and I will say I'm wrong, because I would love to find Perry the monk. But even if that's not true, there certainly was something incredibly important happening at Big Sur in the 1970s with cannabis. So yeah, it was like a whole arc of the story.
This episode is brought to you by Fat Nugs Magazine, a global perspective of cannabis and stoner culture as a bridge to the rest of the world. Right now, you can join Fat Nugs Magazine, Beard Bros Farms, Freedom Grow, and Jailed for Weed in the upcoming Prisoners Edition and help spotlight current and past cannabis prisoners and their stories, because no one should be in jail for a plant. Find Fat Nugs Magazine's beautiful print copies at your local dispensary, fatnugsmag.com, and on socials. Cannabis culture welcomes us all. And there's something about just that, the story itself, like the mythology behind that. I mean, you even see that like in music, like in rock and roll. Like I have a friend who is a well-known musician from the 60s and 70s, and I've asked him some questions about stories that have come out about who he hung out with and what was done and this and that, and sometimes he'll just look at me and smile and he'll say, hey, well, I know them, but that didn't happen. But there's something about the mythology that you just kind of leave the story out there and it captures people's minds, it captures their imaginations. And I think we kind of see that also in the history of cannabis as well.
Yeah, storytelling is powerful, right? It changes how we look at the world and how we feel about things. And especially storytelling with drug experiences is incredibly powerful. Where if we have, cannabis and, um, whether it's Big Sur Holy Weed and you have it and you think this came straight from the monk named Perry and, this helped him meditate. Now I'm going to consume it and that's going to change your drug experience with it. But that's true with like a lot of different types of cannabis where if you have Durban poison and you're like, oh, this comes from Africa, this is like so like connecting, that's going to change your drug experience with that based on the story around it. And as a journalist, I'm all about the stories. So like I totally buy into that. The real power of stories, whether or not they're 100% verifiable, they're still powerful.
Yeah, they are. I when I was still working in the dispensary during the 215 days where we're like opening the jars and measuring out. We had Durban poison in, and a patient came in and she was from Durban. And she's like, "Can I smell that?" And I opened it for her, and she just like took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and she's like, "That smells like home." And
Wow.
whether it's because of, just the suggestion of it being from there, or whether, there were just like some notes that just took her back to a time, it was like incredibly powerful. And those stories are like, like you, I just think storytelling is such a rich part of the connection. Do you think that if there wasn't a Big Sur Holy Weed, like one, do you think that maybe part of it was the expression of terroir with these plants?
Uh, I think it could be. I think terroir with cannabis is so complicated, and
Hmm.
I'm not the expert. And I can't wait for scientists and farmers to really figure it out. There's no question that cannabis is affected by the environment around it, from the soil, right? The microbes and the type of microbes to the um, all of the other environmental factors around it. It changes cannabis so much. There's been some really interesting work of like cannabis collectives having the same genetics and then bring them to different farms and then seeing what happens.
I love
And
that.
yeah, and like chemically speaking, the farms exude different aspects of it, right? So I think that is clearly real. What does it mean for all of Big Sur to have like one terroir? Like, I don't know. I'm just not sure. It's not really my area of like expertise. And going back to kind of the critical side, like I would love to say like there is a flavor of Big Sur cannabis, but I just don't know. Like I haven't seen it proven. I haven't been able to try a lot of Big Sur cannabis myself, honestly. Like I actually have never consumed any cannabis grown in Big Sur. Like I've consumed as much Big Sur Holy Weed as I could find, but none of those farms are in Big Sur. And the farmer who I profile in this story, Kodiak, he was growing Big Sur Holy Weed. In Big Sur, but I visited him in the spring, so the flowers were just coming up, and he didn't share any with me, and I haven't seen him since. So like, I just don't know if like Big Sur itself has its own terroir, and um, I also think like one thing I have written about beer a lot as well, and it's interesting because in beer people talk about terroir, but it's actually like a more manufactured product than wine. Wine is like a single like ingredient product essentially. Um, and so people talk about terroir and beer, but then my favorite brewer in the world, who's a total contrarian, like real like kind of like angry guy in many ways, but makes amazing beer.
Uh-huh.
And he's like, terroir and beer is bullshit, but
I love people like that.
terroir,
They're like, let's just cut through everything.
yeah. Yeah. But he's like, but beer has terroir of ideas, which is like more powerful, where it's like a human manufactured product and the humans involved have, because they're all from, like one valley or something, they have these similar ideas, they share ideas, and that is terroir is real. It's not the same as like wine terroir. And so I know for sure Big Sur, especially in the 1970s, would have a terroir of ideas of humans because they were all working together and they were sharing techniques and sharing seeds and all of this stuff. So like, does that create like an expression itself? Where like, is it the soil? Is it the sun? Is it the way it reflects off the Pacific? Or is it actually just that these farms are all working together? They all have dinners together and hang out. And that is like moving everything in one direction. That's a really different direction than you have up in Mendocino. I think that pretty clearly would have been part of it, and still can be part of it. So yeah,
Yeah, I think that the energetic aspect of it is something that can't be denied. I mean, when you go into different farmers and cultivation areas and you see like how it's an expression not only of the genetics but of where they are and the farmer themselves and their style and their ethos, I think it really makes a difference because it also affects their choices as well. And I think like when you were mentioning like beer, it's for our listeners, some of you may not know, but hops is from the family of Cannabaceae, so there is definitely like some relations there too. Which is
for
why I thought it
sure.
was really cool when we started seeing like infused hop beverages on the market.
Are you looking for a lasting, meaningful way to connect with your audience and highlight your brand? Well, listen up, because Planted with Sara Payan is taking on new sponsors. Here's a powerful stat. 20% of listeners are more likely to support brands they hear about on a trusted podcast. And 60% actually look up that product after hearing about it. That's the power of podcasting. Planted with Sara Payan has a unique draw. With remarkable guests, we attract and engage audience that spans all sides of the cannabis spectrum. Picture your message reaching these listeners time and again. Podcast ads are evergreen, meaning your brand stays relevant as new audiences discover and binge past episodes. It's a long-term investment that keeps on giving. If you're looking for a targeted, passionate audience with lasting impact, the right listeners are here waiting to meet your brand. Visit plantedwithsara.com to get a copy of our sponsorship deck today.
Yeah, totally. I mean they're the most closely related plants, I think, like cannabis and hops, compared to any other plants. So they share a bunch. Like they share so many different flavor overlaps and
myrcene. There's a lot of richness in the myrcene for both too.
Yeah, I mean the terpenes, right? The terpenes are actually like almost essentially identical. There's like, so because I'm a beer person too, I could really talk about this for a long time. But there's some interesting work of trying to create like cannabis and hop hybrids, where hops are not annual plants; they're perennial plants, and so like they can be grown in totally different ways. Hops are grown on vines, these vines, and so this is like goes into like real industrial agriculture. But there's like people trying to grow cannabis on vines that are not replanted and can be harvested by machines. That's how closely related they are.
That's wild.
So like, yeah, it's like a ripe area for a lot of agriculture.
Yeah. Well, okay. Going back to Kodiak, you describe hiking through Big Sur with him. What was that like?
It was a trip. Kodiak is a really fascinating guy. He was born in Big Sur. He grew up there. He's also his main profession is actually photography. He's like an incredible landscape photographer, and he's worked for newspapers, and that's his main thing. But he's grown cannabis. I think like a lot of people in Big Sur, he's grown cannabis on the side. And I it I wasn't trying to find him. I was trying to find Hardy Nito, the guy who gave Jim Roberts his Big Sur Holy Weed, and I'd reached out to a cannabis geneticist, and or cannabis genetics company, and they were like, "Hey, like I don't know Hardy Nito, but you got to talk to Kodiak. Here's his number." And so I just called Kodiak, and he was like, he kind of has like a little bit of a gruffness to him of someone kind of living in the country. And he was like, I don't really want to talk to you about Big Sur Holy Weed. And I was like, okay, like, could I come down there? And he's like, yeah, if you want to talk about Big Sur Holy Weed, come down here and meet me at Deachin's, which for anyone who hasn't been to Deachin's or Big Sur, like when you go to Big Sur, definitely visit Deachin's. It's like a picture of old Big Sur, this really amazing inn and restaurant tucked in the redwoods, the foggy redwoods of Big Sur. And so, I just drove down there and met him for breakfast at Deachin's, and immediately we start arguing about wildfire prevention. Like me being a journalist and him being like kind of a grisly guy. He's like, "No, you're totally wrong about that." And I'm like, okay. And eventually, I was like, 20 minutes later, I was like, "Let's just talk about Big Sur Holy Weed, not wildfire prevention." But the entire time, he'd never agreed to show me his plants because he was in a difficult situation where his farm is losing its permit, and he had to keep his plants at a neighbor's property, or really not a neighbor, but someone else's property. And he was like, I don't want to take you there. It's not my land. But after sitting with him in Deachin's, and there's literally like fog around Deachin's for like an hour and a half, eventually he was like, okay, I'll take you to the Big Sur Holy Weed. So then he drives me, jump into his like beat up Toyota truck, and drives down this winding road, past like two gates, parks. And Big Sur is funny because it's become so expensive and sought after by like some ultra wealthy people, some of the wealthiest people in the world, that you go down these dirt roads that wind forever, and then you pull over and there's just like a mega mansion right in front of you. It's just mixed in with someone whose parents probably bought the land straight from San Francisco in like 1970, and they're barely holding on to the cliff in a shack. So he parks next to like a very impressive mansion. I'm like, I don't like, where are we going? And then he just gets out without telling me anything and starts kind of half running up this path. Through the sagebrush and the yellow grass. And eventually we find these plants on the hillside that he's kind of guerrilla farming, which is really the history of Big Sur is like guerrilla farming. It's not as much like, hey, there's a farm next to my house, but like, hey, there's a farm like 5 miles up this road that I hike to every single day to tend to. And so he was kind of guerrilla farming up on this hillside, and up there's like, I think there was probably like 6 or 8 plants, and it was just his core genetics that he was keeping alive. And even if his farm was going to go under, he wasn't going to let these genetics die. So
That's
we
awesome.
eventually did see the Big Sur.
Was this I was one of the questions I was gonna ask you, and it might be like kind of connected to this moment, but like was there a part in the investigation where you're like things are getting a little weird?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, throughout this investigation, like a lot of people in cannabis, especially people from that era, don't want to talk about anything.
Yeah.
And like they'll just say like, no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. And I was running into that a lot. Like it just, and it kind of gets to what I was saying earlier, where it's like, as a traditional journalist, if someone told me a story and I run into people saying like, I'm not going to tell you anything about it, then like, okay, maybe that person's lying. But in cannabis, you can't think that, because there's just this like kind of almost PTSD from decades of trauma that people are just not ready to talk about. What they were doing in the 1980s or the 1990s or earlier, because it's still just raw. So yeah, definitely things get weird.
Yeah, well, and I also think like as, maybe people were wanting to participate in the regulated market and they're no longer able to do that, then there's a cause to kind of pull back too, because they may still want to, I mean, they have a love of the plant. They're going to want to be engaged, but they also don't want to get in trouble. And we are seeing increased enforcement as the state has become very um, disappointed in the lack of tax revenue. I mean, and it just seems like it goes back to the whole 64 thing. Like, I'm the vice chair of the state advisory committee. And, I've talked about the fact of if you lower the barrier to entry and you lower taxes, you'd be making way more and we would be seeing a much healthier industry and people actually keeping their businesses. So what do you do when you love the plant, but you can't actually exist in a legal landscape?
Yeah, and for many of these people, they may have invested their life savings into trying to get into the legal market, and now that life savings is gone. And maybe they mortgaged their house, and now they've lost their house too. So
Yeah.
like the pain is like incredibly multifaceted. It's coming from all sides. You survived prohibition, but now you've been killed by legalization, and you may be on your last dollar in many ways. So it's just it's a brutal environment out there, that is just pretty sad all around.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and with everything, I mean, and for those of you listening, check out the article on SF Gate because it's fascinating and there's a lot of great information packed in there. But as a writer myself, I know there's always things that you can't include everything. What are some of the things that you learned that you wanted to include in the article but weren't able to?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One, like the article really talks about 1970s Big Sur cannabis cultivation and then
Yeah.
talks about present day. It doesn't talk at all about the 1980s and 1990s, which were really robust times in Big Sur. That I did interviews with people who were part of that, and their stories are just wild. This kind of goes to that the hiking. They were hiking all over Big Sur and growing lots of cannabis, and the whole camp program, the federal enforcement was running helicopters and, like guys bungee jumping out of helicopters down to their grows like 10 miles up the cliffs of Big Sur. So that whole history is not in the story at all. And just because I just couldn't fit it in, the story was already so long. So honestly, as a journalist, you always take people's time, and I feel bad when I take people's time and they don't end up in a story. And so I feel bad because there are a few different people who I talked to for a while, and their stories are not in this one. So yeah, I wish we could have had more time to talk about that. And then also actually Jim Belushi, Jim Belushi, who's I think like I'm a journalist, I'm not supposed to have favorites, but like one of my favorite celebrities in cannabis because he really is like in cannabis. He's really growing cannabis and really is like not just trying to white label stuff and not just trying to make a quick buck. Um, he is growing Big Sur Holy Weed. He actually in his show he had an episode about Big Sur Holy Weed, which I saw after I started this journey. But I interviewed him for the story too, and he is such a good interview because he's a comedian and a musician. And I asked him, would it matter to him if the story was all bullshit? If there was no monk, the Perry the monk, if there was no even really Big Sur Holy Weed, and he just had this like fantastic response, and he was like, he responded by telling me this very strange myth from Albania about a mother who was frozen in stone but maintained her kids by leaving one arm out, and this myth went on for a long time. And he got to the end of it and he was just like, like I don't think any of that's true, but I love the story. And so like that was his point, was like it's about the story. It's not about Perry the monk. And I tried really hard to fit him into this story. And as a writer, this, like sometimes it just doesn't work. So I'm really sorry, Jim, that you're not in the story. Still an amazing guy. So yeah, it's funny. Even in a story, it sounds kind of almost fake, but like this is one of the longest stories I've ever published, over 6,000 words. It takes like 35 minutes to read, and there's still so much I couldn't fit in. So it's kind of funny that even in a long story, I still couldn't fit everything in.
Man, and Jim is a great interview. We've had him on the show here. Especially like I like his stories about, Captain Jack and stuff like
Yeah,
that. Like
yeah, the
he's
hookup at SNL.
yeah, yeah. And then I was kind of like, so that Billy Joel song, Captain Jack, will get you high tonight. Is that the same
Oh,
one? And I'm kind of like, next time I talk to him, I've got to ask him that.
yeah.
He's a fascinating dude. Um, I was, the story that you wrote, is it different than the one or this actually, let me rephrase it. When you were starting to write the story, is it very different than what you ended up publishing?
Uh, when I started, I try to have an open mind to everything, but I wanted to find the monk. That was like the thing I was after. That was going to be like the gold for the story and for my publication. That if I confirmed this monk, if I found some photos of a monk growing cannabis, that would have been an incredible story. And I didn't. I found kind of the opposite. So, no, I didn't. I didn't publish what I perfectly wanted to when I started. But in other ways, I did because I really just wanted to shine a light on these types of plants, the people trying to maintain these types of plants, and what they're doing. And I learned so much through it. I really am like a different person in many ways after because of trying to dive into this stuff. So in that ways, it was exactly what I wanted. I just wanted to spend time on the idea and come up with something.
Yeah. Well, and I think it really highlights to, especially, when you're talking to the farmers and today, like how much we need to support small farmers. And I feel like when we're getting into, I mean, we're on the cusp of having conversations about, well, we are having conversations. We're on the cusp of appellations programs that I think could be really helpful for getting the public engaged and understanding more about how special these regions are and the farmers. But what are some things that you're excited and hopeful about in the future?
I see the I see the industry getting better really like every month. Like I think there's a lot of um, good things happening. I mean, there's a lot of really bad fallout that's happened over the last 4 years, and most of my work as a journalist in cannabis has been writing about that fallout. But at the same time, like I see things getting better all the time. I see certain farms being able to survive, and that's a sign that it is possible. And I also see the lawmakers waking up. When I started writing about cannabis for SF Gate 3 years ago, over 3 years ago, the general thing you would hear from lawmakers was that cannabis farms were making so much money, And now, and they weren't at the time at all. They were just losing money. And now they're saying the opposite. So at least people know that that's not happening. And that's kind of like the at least a place to start on making more sensible laws and reforming things. So I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism in that regard. And I think just like the connection between the cannabis consumer and these farms is starting to grow. It's still in the infant stage, especially compared to other products. Like the way, if you're really passionate about seafood or meat or produce or wine or beer, you can have a really great connection with those producers and you can understand what they're doing. And that's really hard with cannabis, but it's starting to slowly change. And so I see things like the possibility of having retail sales at farms, the possibility of having shipping from farms, from the smallest farms for both of those things. Those are kind of almost becoming a reality. Like the shipping's not real yet, but farmhouse sales are just about going to become a reality. So like the possible those like small doors opening is just going to really make what this story is about, these farmers, more possible to stay alive. So I'm optimistic. I think if you invest a lot in cannabis, especially if you started your own businesses, it's really hard to be optimistic for really good reason. Like I'm not going to tell you to be optimistic if you lost all your money in 64.
Yeah.
But as someone who's a consumer, I feel really optimistic about what's happening in the future.
Yeah. Lester, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for sharing these stories, because the more these stories are out, the more conversations are happening. And I always like to say conversation is normalization, and the storytelling brings a human face to something that's been in the shadows for so long. I mean, it's when somebody meets a farmer or gets to walk into their space, they get it, they feel it. But how many people actually have the opportunity to do that? And I think also, when we're engaging people who are interested in cannabis and seeing what's going on and what's going right and what's going wrong, it's also a platform for people who may not be as interested in how the government works to have more civic engagement. Because, for those of you listening out there, you have a voice. Voting is your superpower. And our elected officials, a lot of them have an outdated view of who the average cannabis user is or cultivator. And it's up to us to show them that, we contribute to society, we pay taxes, we use or appreciate cannabis, and we also vote. So thank you for being in this. Your stories are so incredibly important, and your balanced perspective is very, very needed. For people who want to follow you, check out more articles, and you also write about a lot of other things other than cannabis. How do they do that?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for
Yeah.
having your podcast. I mean, you highlight so many really impactful people. So thank you
Thank
for the
you.
work you're doing. If you want to follow me, I'm on Instagram. Letter with 3 Ds is my Instagram name. I'm also on LinkedIn pretty heavily, so I'm over there. And then, yeah, I write for sfgate.com. So if you just check out our website, that's where most of my work lives these days.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for those of you listening out there, support media. Without the media, you don't get the news, you get bias. So whether it's a podcast, your favorite journalist, your favorite magazine, and especially for those of us in the industry, it's really important to support media now more than ever, because if we don't have a seat on the table, we're definitely on the menu. Lester, I have had so much fun talking to you, and we could have talked for so much longer, and I'd love to have you back again. So thank you for
Yeah, let's do it
everything.
again. Yeah, there's so many more things we could talk about. Kind of like everything we're talking about, I could talk about for hours. So
I know,
really
same. And it was
conversation.
really, I wanted to make sure that we got into the nitty gritty of the article. But there were so many other directions where we could have totally geeked out on. So this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
And everyone, remember, if you like listening, please Give us a review, share it with a friend, let us know what your favorite episodes are, and if you'd like to stay in touch over social media, we are Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook and Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.plantedwithsara.com, or listen to us on our parent network, Radio Misfits Network, where there are other great podcasts, like one of my favorites, the Winemakers Podcast. So check it out. You can listen to Planted wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, whether that's Pandora, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Apple, Stitcher. Tune in. We are there. So join us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, it's a wild world out there. Be good to one another. Until next time, take care.